Beacon Press Audio presents A Paradise of Small Houses, The Evolution, Devolution, and Potential Rebirth of Urban Housing by Max Podemski. This audiobook is narrated by Rob Greenbaum. Published by Beacon Press Audio, 2024. Introduction. The House on Morrison. My grandparents' house was on 43rd Avenue and Morrison Street in southeast Portland, Oregon. The interior design was reminiscent of a Polish Baroque palace as imagined by Liberace. A shag carpet covered the floor of the living room with 3-inch yellow and red strands like spaghetti in marinara sauce. The shelves were lined with purple and gold German glassware and silver goblets. An oil portrait of my aunt, which my family referred to as the Mona Paula, peered down from over the fireplace, painted by an admirer of hers. As a child, when I came to visit, I would search for the big bag of mini Crunch Bars that I knew my grandmother kept somewhere in the house. After scouring the drawers of the oak and marble furniture, sometimes all I would come up with were silver dollars and gold Krugerrands that she hid in case she had to flee in the middle of the night. My grandparents were born in the 1910s in the shtetls of southern Poland. My grandfather, Max, came from a very poor family, and when he was 6 was sent to work in one of the giant textile factories in the large city of Łódź. With virtually no formal education, he never learned to read. However, he became a master tailor, wore colorful 3-piece suits, and had a refined sensibility. My grandmother, Anna, was the daughter of a baker and spoke 5 languages. However, in English, she was prone to malapropisms and would refer to a chest of drawers as Chester drawers. Instead of saying urban renewal, she would say Irving renewal, perhaps in confusion with the name of a Portland street. After surviving Auschwitz, my grandparents married in Łódź and started to rebuild their lives. However, they were soon forced to flee Poland in 1951 with their 2 children, my father and aunt, after Polish partisans began murdering Jews. After stints in Israel and a displaced persons camp in Hanover, Germany, they came through Ellis Island and ended up in the Pacific Northwest. By cleaning houses and working in clothing stores, every few years they moved a little farther from the Jewish immigrant enclave of South Portland where they'd first landed. In 1962, they built the house on Morrison Street. The house they built, a squat brick duplex with a long, low-slung roof resembling an army barrack, was aggressively plain, especially when compared with the small arts and crafts bungalows that surrounded it. However, it contained subtly ingenious features. The entrance to my grandparents' unit faced Morrison Street, and the entrance to the second unit was off 43rd. Each had 2 bedrooms. There was also a 3rd bedroom sandwiched between the apartments with doors leading into both, in case one ever needed to be enlarged. To make extra money, they would rent out the second unit. And later in life, my grandmother even rented out the basement to a German man named Dietrich, who kept a Volkswagen topped by a canoe in the driveway. As I grew up, my interest shifted from finding candy bars to studying cities. I studied urban planning in Los Angeles, Denmark, Brazil, and New York. I worked for an environmental justice organization to repurpose a blighted flood control channel and dangerous alleys into parks and public spaces, and developed policies for the city of Los Angeles to alleviate the crippling housing crisis. However, over time, I learned that planners and policymakers have not had even a fraction of the impact on the urban form of neighborhoods that people like my grandparents have. Our nation's cities are, by and large, the work of immigrant and working-class people who scraped together funds and built a small home for themselves, sometimes with an extra unit or 2 for rental income. The result of this work is often discordant, messy, and, for anyone who has tried to navigate a vehicle through the winding streets of central Boston or renovate an old Victorian house, poorly suited to contemporary times. However, it has also resulted in rich and vibrant neighborhoods that are today some of the most beloved in the entire country. Yet, although the simple houses and apartment buildings that compose our communities have played a monumental role in shaping our nation's cities, the average person knows very little about them. This book is an attempt to tell the story of these buildings and, through them, tell the broader story of the American city. In nearly every town and city across the United States, there is an old house that has been preserved for posterity as a historic artifact and opened for the public to visit. In Brownville, Nebraska, population 142, the former home of a Civil War-era captain sits on broad, manicured grounds with a heavily ornamented facade resembling a dollhouse. In Los Angeles, ornate Victorian homes have been rescued from demolition and transported to a slender lot on the shoulder of the Pasadena freeway. Men costumed in top hats and women in giant hoop dresses walk the grounds. In both settings, the formal rooms are decorated with period decor. Details like a rag doll on a child's bed or an enormous wood cauldron in the kitchen are meant to give a window into how people here once lived. It is this type of structure that forms the popular conception of housing in the United States. However, the reality is that most Americans were not wealthy enough to live in lavish and expansive homes, or even ones designed by a trained architect. In rural areas, they were built by the inhabitants themselves, with the assistance of a few neighbors, using local materials and simple construction methods adapted from ancient practices. These homes, with their thatch roofs and mud or stone facades sheltering 1 to 3 multipurpose rooms, often looked like natural outcroppings of the landscape. In cities, communities of local builders took on the job of constructing housing. These urban homes, like their rural counterparts, were based on ancient floor plans and composed of multipurpose rooms. They were often built at a modest and affordable scale, created livable and hospitable interior spaces with access to light and open space, and were flexibly designed to adapt to social and demographic trends. Such buildings are largely the product of immigrants who financed, developed, and lived in them. It is not the gingerbread mansions of tourist brochure lore, but these common, everyday houses that represent our nation's most enduring architectural achievement. However, urban housing also represents the nation's deep inequity, where Black people and other people of color were, and continue to be, left off the ladder of economic opportunity. Just a few years after its founding in the late 17th century, the Terrace House of England was brought to colonial Philadelphia and adapted into the row house. This small home, attached via its sidewalls to a series of identical neighbors, was well suited to the crowded city, and also offered each household a greater sense of privacy and independence than an apartment offered. This incredibly versatile building type could be adapted still further depending on the occupant, from a rich magnate's limestone townhouse to the poorest worker's tiny one-room version, called a trinity, that required a ladder to ascend to the upper floors. In 19th century New Orleans, refugees of the Haitian Revolution settled on the outskirts of the city, where they built shotgun-style houses, long and narrow structures in which each room led directly to the next. This type of home had originally been introduced to the Caribbean by enslaved people from Africa, where it took on influences from the dwelling styles of the Arawak people, as well as neoclassical architecture from Europe. Its unique climate-adaptive features and innovative frame construction led the shotgun house to become the dominant housing type in New Orleans, and eventually spread across the country. In Chicago, which grew from a provisional outpost into one of the world's largest cities in the few decades between the Civil War and turn of the century, builders invented an entirely new construction method, the balloon frame, which made it possible for a simple worker's cottage to be erected in a matter of days. Their lightweight construction.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?